So today we're going to be talking about the integumentary system. What is the integumentary system? What does that really mean? Well, the integumentary system is the system that covers the skin and then its supportive structures. The skin's called a membrane because it covers all the body, but it's also called an organ because it contains lots of different types of tissues. A lot of studies call it a system because it has organs and then other parts that work together for specific functions. So when we think about the skin, we have to think about it as more than just what we see on the outside. There's a lot more to it. On average, adult skin covers over 3,000 square inches of surface area, and it actually accounts for about 15% of your total body weight. So there's three basic layers of the skin. There's the epidermis, the dermis, and then the subcutaneous fascia, or also called the hypodermis. Now the epidermis, this is the outermost layer of the skin, and it's really made up of 5 or 6 smaller layers, but it has two main layers, and that's the stratum corneum. That's the outermost layer, and these cells are just constantly shut off. And then underneath that is the stratum germinativum, which provides cells to replace the cells in the stratum corneum. Now, the epidermis does not have any blood vessels or nerve cells. The dermis, this we also call the true skin or the dorium. It has a framework of elastic connective tissue, and it does contain blood vessels. It has lymph vessels, nerves, involuntary muscles, sweat and oil glands, and hair follicles also. The top of the dermis is covered with papillae, and these are ridges on the and that fits into the ridges, on the stratum germinativum and the epidermis. And so those ridges form lines, and those ridges are unique for each person. So, for example, your fingerprints and footprints. And they are a way that we can actually identify people. Now, the last layer, the subcutaneous fascia or hypodermis, this is the innermost layer, and it's made of elastic and fibrous connective tissue as well as adipose tissue, and this actually connects the skin to those underlying muscles. Now, the glands of the skin, we have two basic types. We have sudoriferous glands, and then we have sebaceous glands. So the sudoriferous glands are sweat glands, and they're like these coiled tubes that extend up to the outside of the dermis so that they actually open, and that's what's called a pore. So they eliminate sweat or perspiration, and that contains water and salts, and then also some body wastes. So those body wastes, that's one of the, when we talk about the functions of the skin, that's what we're, where we're getting rid of some of those wastes. Sweat generally is basically odorless. It's just that when sweat interacts with bacteria that's on the skin, that's when you end up with body odor. Now, the process of perspiration when we sweat, that helps us to remove excess water from the body. It also cools the body as sweat evaporates into the air. So again, when we think about, those functions of the integumentary system, and we talk about regulating temperature, that's kind of another aspect of that. The sebaceous glands, those are oil glands, and they're usually open onto a hair follicle, and they produce oil or sebum, and that helps the hair to stop the hair from getting too dry and brittle. Sebum's slightly acidic, and so it can act as an antibacterial and antifungal secretion also. When you end up getting like pimples or blackheads, that's when that oil gland becomes plugged with dirt and oil. Now, other aspects or other parts of the integumentary system is the hair. And hair consists of a root that grows into a hollow tube called a follicle, and that's then the end of the hair shaft. So that's where that hair is growing from. Helps to protect the body, and it covers all our body surfaces except the palms of our hand and the soles of our feet. Those are the places that we don't actually have any hair follicles. When we think of diseases associated with that, alopecia or baldness, is something that you think about, and that can be a permanent loss of hair on the scalp. It's oftentimes a genetic condition and is common in men, but can also occur in women. And then when we think about nails, nails help protect the fingers and toes from injuries, and it's made of dead keratinized epidermal epithelial cells. They're packed very closely together, and then they form that thick, dense surface. So the cells are formed in what we call the nail bed, and they will regrow if the nail is lost and the bed is not damaged. However, if you have an injury that damages that nail bed, your fingernail may not grow back or may never grow back normally. So the functions of the integumentary system, again, when we talked about some of those things in looking at those hair follicles or having hair on the skin, etc. So functions are protection, sensory perception, regulation of body temperature, storage, absorption, excretion, and production. So what does that really mean when we're talking about those different functions? Well, when we think about protection, the skin is a barrier. It protects us from all those invasions of pathogens, all those bacteria and viruses and so forth that are out in the environment. It holds in moisture and helps to keep us from drying out. It's also a barrier from the sun's ultraviolet rays. Now, sensory perception, we have nerves that are present in our skin, and they help us communicate with the outside world. So they're going to respond to things like pain and pressure and temperature. So if you're sitting at your desk and you're holding your pencil, your receptors there, they can feel you holding that pencil, so it makes you aware of what's happening to the outside of the body. Regulation body temperature. Blood vessels in the skin help us to either retain or lose heat. So when you're exercising, you get all flushed or red looking. That's because those vessels are dilating and we're letting heat escape. When you get cold and you turn purpley, you kind of look that purpley mottled. What's happening is those vessels are constricting so that they are going to hold in heat. And then the sudoriferous glands also help us cool the body, like I talked about earlier, with evaporation and perspiration. Storage, the skin has lots of tissues that help us temporarily store fat and sugar, water and vitamins and some of the salts. Also stores adipose tissue in the subcutaneous fascia, which is a source of energy. Absorption, we can absorb certain substances, including toxins, through the skin. So some medications can be absorbed through the skin. So it can help us absorb both good and bad things sometimes. Excretion, we eliminate salts through the skin. We are also going to eliminate some excess water, and that's through perspiration or sweat. And then production, the skin helps us produce vitamin D. We use this ultraviolet rays from the sun as that initial start to that vitamin D production. Skin color and pigmentation. This is inherited and determined by pigments in the epidermis. So it has to do with, what kind of those pigments you have. So we have melanin, and this is a brownish or black pigment, and it's produced in the epidermis. And although everybody has the same number of melanocytes, some people with certain genes, we might have the same number of melanocytes, but they're going to produce more melanin. So that hyperproduction or a big production of melanin, that's going to lead to black or brown or yellowish skin tint, depending upon the racial origin. Also, ultraviolet light activates melanocytes, and so they're going to produce more melanin to protect and tan the skin. And then if you have just small concentrated areas of melanin pigment in the skin, that's what a freckle is. So keratin, this is a yellowish or red pigment, and then also helps to determine skin color. And again, you have those present, but it's how how much of the pigment, excuse me, how much pigment um, is produced determines our skin color. Now, when you hear the term albino, what this means is it's an absence of skin color pigment. So somebody, or either human or animal, that's an albino, they lack those skin pigments, which means that they look pinkish. And they look pinkish because you're seeing that underlying vascular system. Hair is generally very pale yellow or white, and the eyes are red in color and also very sensitive to light. So some skin colors that are abnormal, we think of erythema. Erythema is that reddish color to the skin. It can be caused by a burn or a congestion of blood vessels. Jaundice, this is a yellow or kind of orangish tint to the skin. This can indicate a buildup of bilirubin in the blood. We see this in things like liver disease. Cyanosis, this is a bluish discoloration to the skin. So cyan means blue, osis is condition of, so that's that blue condition, and again caused by insufficient oxygen. And we associate that with like heart or lung disease. And then sometimes you can have like this gray or brown discoloration to the skin, and you can actually get a couple other like kind of those, it's almost like a silvery color to the skin, and this can be indicative of poisoning. Now we have lots of different skin eruptions that can occur. The skin is just really sometimes difficult to figure out what's going on with it. So we have all these different, like, pimples or discolorations and things that happen on the skin. Sometimes we're just not even sure why, but what's going on that's causing that. But we look at those different kinds of rashes. So one type is macule or a macular rash, and that's those flat spots on the skin. An example of a macule is a freckle. Papules, these are firm raised areas. We see this with pimples and things like chickenpox as a stage, actually an earlier stage of the chickenpox. Vesicles, this is where we're ending up with blisters and there's fluid filled sacs. So in those later stages of chickenpox, we see those little pimply kind of things. That papular rash kind of changes into that vesicle rash where you get those blisters. Pustules, these are sacs filled with pus, for example, acne. Crusts, that's a scab, so that's dried pus and blood. When we think about wheals, these are itchy elevated areas with an irregular shape, and we see this with hives and different insect bites. Ulcers, this is a deep loss of skin surface. It can extend past, actually, from the epidermis down into the dermis, and with like a big decubitus ulcer, it can extend all the way down into muscle and bone. So we have all different types of different eruptions that you can see on the skin. Oh yeah, and then the cyst. A cyst is a closed sac and with a very distinct membrane, and oftentimes you see those and you really feel them more under the skin than see them. Now, when we think about various diseases or abnormal conditions like that, there are several different ones. So there's acne vulgaris. We have athlete's foot, cancer, dermatitis, eczema, impetigo, psoriasis, ringworm, and then verruca or warts. And these are all kind of different conditions with different causes. So what I want you to do, if you'll see in your notes that it says define each of these before you turn in your notes. So I want a good description of what each of these is, as well as what kind of what the symptoms might be, what kind of treatments you might find. So make sure that you turn those notes in completely.